Good morning, Doug. Today we want to talk about democracy. In a previous episode, you said something about that you wanted to debunk democracy. And what do you mean by that? And what are your feelings on democracy in general?
Yeah, this is really the third rail in this country. Debunking democracy is like coming out and being a virulent atheist. Most people will hate you. Uh, all right, where to start on this thing? It's such a big subject. Democracy has actually become a secular religion. And in fact, I forget who it was that said was that democracy was a religion for people that are deprived of the traditional kind that involves God and so forth. And you dare not say anything against it because they will automatically assume that you are a, a communist or a socialist or, God forbid, an anarchist, or that you want to overthrow the government. I mean, it's democracy is something that you can't say anything bad about, and everything that you hear about democracy is good. So what is democracy? Well, it comes from the Greek, as everybody knows, and it basically means demos, the people, and cracy, like aristocracy is rule of the best. It's the rule. It's the rule of the people. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? And maybe I should start off by using a couple of my favorite quotes. One by Stalin, and he said, "Who votes doesn't matter. What matters is who counts the votes." And that's absolutely true. And that's a lot of
relevant. Seems particularly relevant these days.
Oh, completely relevant. Yeah. So once again, Stalin proves correct. Like another famous quote by him is he said, "One death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic." It's also true. So anyway, also Churchill has two famous, one much more famous than the other, statements about democracy. One is that democracy is the worst kind of political system except for all the others. Not true, but everybody believes it because Churchill said it, and it's very pithy. And the other thing he said, which is true, is that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Totally true on that one. So, looking at democracy, ever since, except in ancient times, which is to say Athens and different kind of democracy in the Roman Republic, democracy really didn't exist anywhere until the 19th century, when a few of them came out, starting with the American Revolution and then the French Revolution, which didn't end well. And then lots of democracies came into existence during the 20th century. And now everybody's a democracy. If you're not a democracy, you're not taken seriously, you're looked upon. So even places like North Korea, which is a democratic republic.
Of course it is.
So, this should make anybody suspicious of the fact that democracy maybe isn't all it's knocked up to be.
Do you think that the reason that democracy do you think democracy got conflated with other Enlightenment values, which part of the American Revolution? Like, there are some great values that came out of the American Revolution, obviously.
Yeah.
Democracy just went along with it, sort of, but it wasn't like the kind of democracy we have now. But do you think it got conflated? Is that why it has this positive branding?
Well, I think that as the revolution was going on and after it was over, people were still, Americans were still trying to decide what type of government they were going to have. And there was some question whether George Washington shouldn't actually be something that looked like a king.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing that he was the kind of person he was, and decided not to run again, because if he had, it might have changed all the basic conditions of the country. So yeah, so we have something like a democracy, but the democracy is really just a way of choosing people to rule you. And frankly, I've always called democracy no more than mob rule dressed up in a coat and tie. It's more polite. It has some rules. And people say, well, what we really need is something more like direct democracy. I mean, we can't have these politicians in Washington, in the state capitals, telling us what to do, because they're horrible people. And of course, that's quite correct, because you get a certain type of person that runs for office in a democracy and wants to rule other people. And I would say that it's the worst kind of person, because looked at from a political point of view, there are two kinds of people. There are people that like to deal with the physical universe, and there are people that like to, in effect, rule the physical universe, and there are people that like to rule other people. And those are the type that run for office and become politicians. So of course, they're contemptible. They're professional busybodies. So that alone kind of predestines democracy to end badly. It's basically, I would say, it's basically a fraud that everybody makes obeisance to. So I'm no fan of democracy. And the worst thing about democracy is that it's conflated with freedom. They say freedom and democracy. Well, who needs democracy if you have freedom?
Mm.
I mean, the main argument for democracy is that, hey, it's the way we maintain our freedom. Well, actually, that's not true, because the mob can be and often is much more dangerous than any individual ruler. So I like to stop people cold when they say freedom and democracy. We have to maintain our democracy to maintain our freedom. It's totally untrue. They're two different things.
Yeah, I remember one in the during the Bush Jr. Reign in the United States. He, one of the rallying cry of all of these foreign expeditions that they were having, all these wars, these foreign wars, was that we're spreading democracy to these places around the world. And I remember asking a friend of mine at the time, I'm like, why are we assuming that that's a good, like that is a worthwhile pursuit? I mean, so this feels a lot like the Crusades. We're spreading democracy, we're spreading Christianity. And if they wanted it, they could have it, couldn't they? It didn't seem like they were even interested.
Yeah, in fact, the most recent example that put the lie to that statement was, goodness, remembering obscure politicians. I'm usually not too bad at it, but okay, so Egypt overthrew whoever it was that was running the place for like 30 years. Who am I talking about? Who was that? Was that Mubarak or who?
Mubarak, I think, yeah.
Okay. Then they had an election, and a rather radical Islamist won. And the US colluded with the Egyptian army to kick him out of office. Yeah, and I forget who's running Egypt now, but it's another nasty dictator, just as bad as Mubarak. But we kind of sweep that under the rug. Exactly. So the will of the people means absolutely nothing. And anyway, most of the time, the will of the people is actually pretty stupid, because when you're dealing in a real democracy, you're talking about the lowest common denominator. And unfortunately, if the average IQ of a population is 100, which it is by definition, half of the people are by definition below 100 in IQ. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what you call it when you have that kind of mob rule. I mean, they tend to be most politically active because they think they might get the most in the way of freebies.
Exactly. What do you think? I was just, as you were talking about democracy and direct democracy specifically, um, it made me think that the problem, that someone's argument might be with democracy, that the problem is that democracy just hasn't been done right yet. Almost like the same argument about communism. It could be really good. It just hasn't been done right yet.
Yeah, that's right. We'll do it right the next time. Those Soviets and those Chinese and those Albanians and those North Koreans and God, I wonder how many more, those Romanians and those East Germans and those Cubans. We'll get it right the next time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What
Yeah,
do you,
exactly.
so what is better? What is a better form of of government than if democracy is not, as you say, as Churchill said, it's just better than all the rest. What is the one that's better than all the rest?
Well, actually, wait, but that kind of made me think that something that there are different types of democracies. You got direct democracy, which can work with a half a dozen friends trying to decide what restaurant to go to. And even then it falls apart because there's going to be somebody that really doesn't like spicy food, but everybody else does. So now he's dragged along and he's unhappy. So even then democracy is, let's say, highly flawed. But there's no violence when we're talking friends going out to dinner. So even on that basis, and then you think the only direct democracy that I can think of, and I think the only one that really was of a nation state was Athenian democracy. But even then, when you're talking about the relatively educated and civilized Athenians, quite frankly, during the Peloponnesian War, there was an interesting episode called, people say, well, the average guy is basically good. So you get a bunch of average guys together and they'll tend to do the right thing. This is why democracy is good, because the average guy is good. All right, well, I guess that's a different discussion we could have. But one famous episode in the Peloponnesian War was the island of Melos, which was part of the Athenian League, which evolved into the Athenian Empire, exploiting its members. And they decided they didn't want to go to war against the Spartans. So the Athenians, who were a direct democracy, laid down the law. They said, either you join us in fighting the Spartans, or we will destroy you. And they said, no, we're not. So the Athenians sent their navy to the island of Melos and killed every man, woman, and child on the island. Wow. to create an example. So democracies can be nasty, even under the best circumstances. But people say, well, we don't want a representative democracy because you can't have, there's 300 million Americans and maybe, 225 million are adult of voting age. I don't know, whatever the numbers are. It doesn't really matter. And we're a representative democracy. That's better. And we're a constitutional democracy, which I suppose is better yet, because then we've got a constitution that limits what the mob can do. And I guess that's right. The Constitution must prohibit the government from doing all the terrible things that it does. Everything from rounding up all the Japanese during World War II and putting them in concentration camps. Yeah, I guess the Constitution works. But I'm sorry, it just passed through. What were you saying?
Well, so there's all these different forms of democracy, and my question was, what is a preferable form if democracy doesn't really work for all kinds of reasons? One, because it's rule of the mob one way or another. What does work?
Yeah, well, that's the $64 question. Okay, I think the problem may be genetic, in that for survival reasons, starting from when we first evolved, or even before we evolved into humans, because if we evolved from Australopithecines and so forth, which are basically big monkeys, probably acted pretty much like chimpanzees, our closest relative. In fact, they almost certainly did. So we're herd animals, we're pack animals. And that means some alpha male presents himself as the leader and fights for that position. So that's just the way we're wired genetically. You got to have a leader, and people must love a leader. I mean, people love Trump because he's like an alpha male leader, and people loved Roosevelt, and they loved Hitler, and they loved Mussolini at first, and they loved Stalin. I mean, strong leader. They love Mao, strong leader. Tell us what to do, keep us safe. Just like the monkeys in a pack. Not sure what you call a pack of monkeys. It's not a herd. It's not a flock of chimpanzees.
I can't think of it right now. I know the name. I can't recall right now, though.
It's probably somehow politically incorrect because
everything is.
Everything is, right. And anyway, we can't refer to people in the same way as we would refer to
ourselves, to people this way. Oh, it's a troop.
A troop. Oh, that's like a troop of Boy Scouts, I guess. Okay.
Yeah.
You know, or a cavalry troop, perhaps. All right. Well, anyway. So people just seem to want leadership, and and especially what scares me now with the state of the economy, the way it is, especially, is they want strong leadership to straighten things out and make the country fly right. In my opinion, it's generally the opposite of what generally happens when you get a strong leader. So, okay, what's the answer to this question? I think the only answer is to try as best you can to defang the government so that you can't get a strong leader. And the way you do that is by having a market democracy. So forget about a direct democracy or a representative democracy or a constitutional democracy. Let me put forward and they got other kinds. They got social democrats and they got Christian democrats. They got all kinds of things. But if you don't believe in the institution of the state, which I don't, and I know you don't, then how do you order things so it's not chaos? And a market democracy, I think, is the answer, where if you want something on your property, you do it. If you want to buy something, you find an entrepreneur that's selling it, or become an entrepreneur to provide things to other people. So you vote with your money, and you get what you want. And I don't see what the state itself, and therefore democracy or other forms of running the state or deciding who is the state, brings to the party. Because we've had this conversation before, in that if you're going to have a state, what should the state do? And I think this is the essence of the whole democracy argument. It's that if the state is pure force, and it is, there's no voluntarism about it. As Mao said, it comes out of the barrel of a gun. You pay your taxes or they will do something bad to you. I mean, that's what the state's about. Okay, if force is bad, and I believe force is bad, using it between people, you got to limit it somehow objectively. And the argument is, correct argument, I believe, that if you're going to have force, it should only be used to protect you from force. What does that imply? It implies police to protect you from force within your bailiwick, and a court system to allow you to adjudicate disputes without resorting to force, and something resembling an army to protect you from force outside your community. And that's all government should do. And if that's all government did, I could live with that, no problem. But unfortunately, in today's world, the government does everything but those things. It doesn't do those things very effectively. In fact, I would make, this is the anarchist argument, It's that, in fact, those three things are so important to the conduct of a civilized society. They're way too important to be left to the government and the kind of people that always run it. Those things can be privatized too, as shocking as that might sound to most people. So if you did that, you don't have to have these arguments about is democracy good or bad. It's a market democracy. You just do what you want. You vote with your money for what you want. Don't buy it or support it if you don't want it. But the government can't do anything anyway, other than protect you with the police.
Right. Well,
That's
right.
it.
I mean, right now, I think you're showing like you said, those things are so important. Leaving them up to the state is incredibly risky. I think you see that now. There was this, may have seen some of the news about this, but there was this bar in Staten Island that was, basically just was shut down by the governor because they were in, an orange zone or a red zone or whatever, a high COVID case count. And so they shut down all the businesses there, and they're like, well, we have no choice. Like, we're going to lose everything. We have to open. And so they opened, and they were really defiant about it, saying, no, we're going to open. And ultimately, one of the owners was arrested. And then they put they had sheriffs, New York sheriffs New York City sheriffs, actually is what it was. They put they kind of cordoned off this bar restaurant so that no one could get in. And it does seem like it's hard to not see that as an act of violence on individuals and private property. But it's just, this is a great example of how, if the state has the monopoly on violence, though, how it can lead to awful outcomes, because these people weren't hurting anybody. They weren't forcing anyone to do anything. It was supposedly their property. And, they were destroying their livelihood.
Yeah. And, citizens, it's a bar, they're all adults. I mean, wanted to use it and they couldn't. And these people are acting under the cover of democracy. I mean, I guess in a real democracy, people would go to the bar or do what they want, and you wouldn't have somebody who was Cuomo or de Blasio, whoever.
This is Cuomo.
Yeah, involved in treating them like little children,
right,
and taxing them for the privilege, and incarcerating them, and maybe that bar is going to turn into the American island of Melos, as during the Peloponnesian War. Who can tell? I mean, democracy is no safeguard against anything, as the Japanese American citizens found in California during World War II. They were full-blooded American citizens, but it didn't matter. They were a minority. And in a democracy, if you're a small minority, the majority is always going to overrule and vote against you. So what are you supposed to do? This is why I also believe in secession in today's world as being one step in the right direction towards curing things politically, because you can't have a giant democracy like the US with people that are totally different. There are different racial groups, and this country is breaking up on racial lines, no question about it. Different religious groups, different ethical feelings, totally different economic circumstances, where one group, whether you're on top or whether you're on bottom, they're both trying to take advantage of the other, squeezing the guy in the middle, of course. No, democracy doesn't work. It always ends badly.
It seems like it just gives people cover for bad actions. You know what I mean? It allows, like, it's for the state can say, like this example in New York again, well, this is the will of the people, it's for the protection of the people. We represent, we represent the will of the people. And so it's our job to protect the people. And so that then we have the moral justification for basically unleashing whatever sorts of evil or force or whatever it is that they're interested in doing on individuals.
That's absolutely right. And, taking recent history, for instance, I guess most Americans don't know that Adolf Hitler was popularly elected by a plurality, not by over 50%, but he won by a plurality. But all of our presidents win by pluralities, quite frankly. Few of them. You got over 50% of the actual vote. So no, anything can happen. You can vote for perfectly horrible people, and they win, and then they disguise themselves by saying they have a popular mandate, which I guess they do.
Yeah, I guess. And I think Cuomo is a good example of the strong man. Like he was celebrated early on in this. I mean, he wrote a book about leadership just somehow during this pandemic, about how being a strong leader and making decisive choices, making the hard choices as a leader, and doing these daily press conferences he was doing actually got him an Emmy. So it's
Yeah, absolutely perfectly shocking. And people like him and de Blasio are not only elected, but they're reelected, like Pelosi and and Gavin Newsom, who's her nephew,
yep.
reelected. I mean, I guess the hoi polloi, as the Greeks called them, the mob, or the capitacensi, as the Romans called the head count,
Yep.
they must like it. They must like strong and decisive leadership. Strong leadership. Yeah, they love it. Well, this does not augur well for the US at this point. When you look at all these governors and mayors and how they're locking down the cities and what they're doing under the guise of democracy, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and protecting their flock or their troop, I guess it would be.
Be the troop. Yeah. When was the last time that that in America where we threw, so where a politician was repudiated by their constituents and thrown out of office based upon what they've done? I mean, I just can't think of an example where that's really happened, where it was, they're really punished for their bad behavior.
Where he was impeached and thrown out of office, huh?
Or it doesn't even have to be impeached, but just in the next election, like it was just like a resounding, you're out of here. We don't want anything to do with you. It seems like most incumbents get reelected. The status quo is always maintained despite, how badly places go or how.
Well, well, here's a good example. Herbert Hoover, okay? Now, most people are convinced that he was a free market guy, and it was because he didn't properly stimulate and regulate the economy that after the crash happened in 1929, he did all the wrong things. And therefore, the guy on the white horse, Franklin Roosevelt, straightened everything out. Okay, so Hoover was kicked out of office. He only was a one-term president. But the fact of the matter is that Hoover was an unbelievable statist and dirigiste who raised taxes from 25 to 60%, which really hurt the economy. He shepherded through the, what was that tariff act, that basically killed foreign trade, where we couldn't import anything to the US, and therefore foreigners couldn't afford to buy anything from us. So he did that. And he started all kinds of new agencies, horrible president, in keeping with the kind of people that were elected all over the world in the 1930s. And Roosevelt actually ran on a platform of doing the opposite of what the statist Hoover was doing. And then he did what Hoover did on steroids. So just because you kick out some horrible person doesn't mean that you won't get an even more horrible person, but somebody who had really good public relations, which Roosevelt did. So
Yeah.
that's an example, I guess.
Yeah. I guess that's it. I just trying to think of one in my lifetime. And I know that people are really tired of Bush, in the wars. And so, recently, and that's why I felt like, to me, I always felt like Obama was part of this, was actually elected as like by people being anti-elitist, anti the status quo, anti the normal stuff. And then it turns out he was, just like the rest of them. I mean, just like Bush in many ways, maybe worse in many ways, in terms of his warmongering. But
Yeah, actually.
but I can't remember. It just seems like that no matter what, no matter how bad a politician is, even if they lose just barely. I mean, in an election, it just shows that the democratic process does not actually course correct through its.
No, it doesn't. I'll give you another example, more recent. It's that in 1964, the Republicans put up Barry Goldwater as their candidate, running against Lyndon Johnson, a lifelong swamp creature. And Goldwater was crushed by Johnson in the popular vote because he was painted. He was a conservative. He was a genuine conservative. In fact, Goldwater was almost as much of a libertarian as Ron Paul, in point of fact.
Oh.
Not quite, but very libertarian leading. And they painted him as a warmonger, and which this was just when the war in Vietnam was just starting to ramp up. When actually in my high school, which was a military boarding school, in map reading class, the maps that they had us learning to read were maps of Vietnam. It was perverse. And we were just high school kids. We couldn't find, we were reading maps of Vietnam. And I don't think there was anybody that could find Vietnam on the globe.
On a global map.
Well, we're looking at the maps of Vietnam, perverse. Anyway, so I don't know if Goldwater would have gotten involved in that morass or not. But Johnson, perhaps the most corrupt and the most vulgar and crude of any president I can think of, he won overwhelmingly against Goldwater. So, what good is democracy? Well, it's almost a caucusocracy, the rule by the worst in many cases.
Right, because if
Bush, Father Bush, these presidents are almost universally just horrible people that have, good PR.
Right, and and maybe it's just that that you have so many. When you have a wide open democracy where everybody can participate in it, you end up having lots and lots of uninformed voters, and people who basically really don't know what's really going on. They're persuaded by these emotional buttons, whether they be, that they're going against, convincing conservatives it was really important to vote to stop gay marriage, or, convincing, that the liberals that they had to protect a woman's right to choose, whatever, these like stupid, these issues that were very emotionally driven, that you could just push a button. It seems like you'd get these, robotic responses from most people. They would just like default to responding to things. And it seems like if you have this broad-based democracy where everyone is participating in it, you end up having that lowest common denominator, which can be persuaded with very little information to take certain actions, which then cancels out any informed voters. That's why Goldwater had no chance in that environment, probably.
Yeah, that's right. It's, going back to one of my personal experiences when I was on the Donahue show, I had a full hour, oddly, the day before the national elections elections are always in even years. I forget that. So therefore it was 1979. And Phil and I got into something about, well, who are you voting for tomorrow, basically? And, I said something insulting about the the Republican candidate, and he figured I wasn't going to vote for the Democrat. Then he figured, oh, you must be voting for the Libertarian. And then I started to give him the five reasons why I wasn't voting on the next day, which was election day. And I only got as far as 4 out of the 5 because the audience was becoming very restive and antagonistic. It's a good thing that I didn't get to the 5th one, which was, your vote doesn't count. Or it counts about as much as a grain of sand on a giant seashore, which is actually accurate. So anyway, you're only voting for Tweedledee or Tweedledum,
Yeah.
Somebody that believes a little bit more in the welfare state or a little bit more in the warfare state.
Or at least that's what they present to you, right? Because then you like that, that's FDR didn't represent that he was for these crazy socialist policies, but that's what you ended up getting. So it's even it's just the brand that they're marketing with that, that election cycle. It's not even necessarily what they really believe.
Exactly. And one of the very worst presidents of the US was Woodrow Wilson. And as late as 1916, his slogan was that he used was, he kept us out of the war. And of course, he's exactly who was plumping the next year to get the US into World War I, which is a complete disaster and turned the US into a police state, actually, for 2 years. It's horrible. So, they lie and then do what they want. So now democracy doesn't work. And of course, the argument is basically the state doesn't work and it should be defanged and it should be, do nothing but protect you from force. But even then, the state is not a good idea. And people accept it as part of the cosmic firmament where we must have it and it'll always be here. So in the next election, and I'll speculate now, I think one or both of these two major parties, if they still exist, because the Democratic Party and the Republicans could break up into two, because the Trumpites hate the rhinos.
Yep.
And among the Democrats, you got the really radical socialists.
The AOC branch of the party, and then you got the Nancy Pelosi, right?
Yeah, who are Biden branch. So they could both break up into two or more parties. But during the next election, I will speculate now that one or both of those parties are going to put up a general for their candidate. And my reasoning is the military is the only part of the US government that people really still respect and trust, despite the Pentagon, as corrupt as it is.
Yeah.
Still, everybody likes G.I. Joe. Let's admit it. It's,
Yep.
So we'll get a general. And I think since the situation with China is bound to heat up a lot more, they'll figure, yeah, we need a general that knows how to run the military. So I'd like to place some money bet on that. I don't know who I can do that with. Who am I going to vote for next time? I'm going to vote for nobody. And the reason is why? Because nobody will tell the truth. That's a good reason to vote for nobody. Only nobody will tell the truth.
There's a exactly only nobody. So you got to vote for nobody.
Yeah, a little pun.
Well, there's lots of reasons not to vote. And I think the way that our political leaders actually, turn out to be, whether it's not what they promise, it's not what they're, even if people who are huge Trump fans, they look at it like Trump did promise a lot of things, and for whether he legitimately tried to do all of those things or not, he did not accomplish them. We still have, there are still troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. They're still there. So
They're still there, right?
So whether it was he tried to do it and couldn't do it because it's generals, which seems crazy, or he wasn't that serious about it really anyway. Who knows? The bottom line is that almost whoever you elect, you never really get what you think you're electing anyway.
No, they do what they want once they're in office.
Yes.
Power does go to their heads, always.
It seems like the only way to, one of the strongest argument I got from you years ago about not voting was that it only encourages them. Like it legitimizes the system of these elites. It totally legitimizes it, the fact that you go and you participate in it actively. So,
yep.
So my view has been is not participating because of that reason alone. I just don't, the another good reason, the second best reason I thought I got out of it was, at the end of the day, democracy is you voting for the monopoly on force to coerce the other side to do what you want done, so that you essentially, you're not personally engaging in violence or coercion, but you're asking the state to do it on your behalf to have your preferences met, which seems like that's unethical on its face.
It is. It's actually dishonest besides, and it's cowardly besides. I can't think of any good reasons for a political democracy. I really can't. All I want is personal freedom. And I'd like to think that's all anybody of goodwill wants, is personal freedom. So, but we're not going to be able to, the US government is so gigantic and so ingrained, and people have been taught to conflate it with the country itself. And actually the government is just a dead hand on the country. But we're not going to change anything. And probably all we're doing, if we've convinced anybody of the correctness of what we're saying, is we're just going to make their life miserable. They're just going to get in trouble when things really get wild and woolly. I mean, and if things do, I mean, frankly, all you and I can do, or anybody that we convince, is just dummy up and keep your mouth shut, because the mob will tear us limb for limb for not being one of them. Hey, you're either with us or you're against us.
Exactly. And I'll just wrap up with the thing you said earlier. I think that this is so important. And I never thought about this phrase like this, is that you said, who needs democracy if you have freedom? And I think the conflation of those two things is something that is really, really undermines our freedom. You know, is that we feel like we got to have democracy to have it, and then we legitimize the system by participating in it. Meanwhile, giving up our rights along the way. It's a crazy spiral we're in.
Well, the situation's hopeless. Well, I don't know about you, Matt. I've got to run now. Maybe sometime we can talk about, other than a market democracy, what would that look like? What are the alternatives to a democracy practically? So that's a subject for the future.
What's that on the agenda? Thanks a lot, Doug. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Matt.